Well, for the last few years, I've been working full-time on open banking, working with companies of all shapes and sizes, banks obviously looking at open banking, but also big technology companies, big technology platforms, and very small startups and fintechs who are looking at the opportunities from open banking. My own background is in banking. I spent many years running products for a bank, running international banking, running treasury products, emerging lending products. So I look at these new areas of fintech and open banking with a banker's eyes. I think it's both, and I think it's part of a wider trend in service industries. Typically, banking is the last to adopt new technologies because it's a very conservative industry, and it should be a very conservative industry because it's dealing with people's money. So it needs to maintain trust and maintain security. But I see service industries more broadly moving into competition based on ecosystems versus ecosystems rather than product versus product. So I believe that in the future, if you have a product that may not be the best price or may not be the best features, but if it pops up in front of the customer at the right moment, inside the right ecosystem, it can be successful. And I think in the future you could have a super product with fantastic features and a great price. But if it's isolated by itself and isn't popping up at the right moment in the right ecosystem, it could be a failure. I think the philosophy has to be APIs first. So some banks will look at external communities of developers, freelance developers, as their starting point to start to get feedback from third parties and to start to build a perspective of the market from the developer's eyes. Others will prioritize partner APIs, talking to key suppliers or adjacent providers of services, and start to develop combined services with known partners rather than developers who might emerge. And others will prioritize internal private APIs where they want to start making business processes and services inside the corporation reusable as APIs. So there's many ways to start, but I think the right philosophy is APIs first, and to move away from projects that are unique and once-off efforts, but once they're finished, the output is not repeatable and reusable. So the great strength of APIs is that they are repeatable and reusable, whether it's internally, with partners, or with external developers. I think PSD2 sets a benchmark globally for all regulators and all governments to look at. And whereas Europe might be most advanced in insisting that banks should share their data with non-banks that are regulated under PSD2, we can see a global trend across South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Brazil, Mexico, South Africa. So multiple countries are looking at government-sponsored or regulatory-sponsored efforts to promote the API economy, to increase data sharing, which they believe, correctly in my mind, will increase innovation and competition in financial services. I think all service industries that have gone towards ecosystem-based competition have demonstrated the value to consumers already. That companies working together and using APIs as an enabling technology can produce much better customer experiences and customer services than one company working in isolation. So I think consumers are increasingly in the habit of buying through ecosystems, and some of these ecosystems are now so large, customers would reasonably believe that if a service isn't popping up when it's required in a certain ecosystem, then that service doesn't exist. So if we consider our own behavior with our smartphones, where your smartphone could have access to 2 million apps, those apps would suggest to a consumer that if an app isn't available on their smartphone to provide the relevant service at the right time, then the service doesn't exist. And I think that's a very significant message to any business who is intent on distributing its services on their own and not taking an ecosystem's perspective on the market. Because in the future, you could have a terrific service, but if it's isolated and isn't participating in ecosystems, your entire business could fail. Very much so. I would see open banking as pivotal to financial inclusion. Ecosystems address micro segments. So one big company may be acting as a platform, and then many small organizations using that platform to get access to many customers gives rise to services that are aimed at smaller and smaller segments of the market. And traditionally, banking has focused on the mass market, where banks both develop the service and distribute the service themselves, and haven't relied extensively on an ecosystem of partners. In developing economies like Pakistan, where as the world becomes more digital, you have a choice between opening more branches or giving more and more companies access to contributing to financial inclusion and financial services. And economically and logically, the distribution of services is as much about digital ecosystems in the 21st century as it is about physical outlets. I think the mindset obviously has to be different, in that all services are considered from the perspective of both the end user and of third parties who are going to use these components or contribute to the service. Everybody in the process is under the command and control of the organization itself. Everybody is staff or is a contracted company that's working on the solution. Ecosystems need to be orchestrated, and inside ecosystems, companies are orchestrated by others. So collaboration is key, and when you're operating in ecosystems, feedback is coming from many more directions, and feedback is coming very quickly. So for large organizations that have been closed in terms of their innovation, and everybody works for the company, is under command and control of the executive sponsoring the innovation, this is a very significant change. So you're turning your organization almost inside out and exposing not only your technology, but your decision making and your risk control to multiple parties. So in many ways, the manner in which companies make money won't change too much. However, the speed at which they will have to respond to the marketplace in this ecosystems environment will increase very significantly. And in that respect, it's a major challenge for decision making in the product development process. In terms of infrastructure, I think it means that the systems that deliver services for a company need to be available to third parties, obviously, as well as customers, scalable, in that the intention of open banking is that the innovation speed goes up and the competition speed goes up, so volumes of transactions obviously will go up. And lastly, extensible or integratable, and this is where APIs enter into the picture. If you don't have APIs and API management platforms, you can't create a catalog of all of the APIs that you're using to connect both internally and externally to the ecosystem. You can't keep track on their performance, their responsiveness, and the money you're making from specific ones that you're charging for. So I think that there's a significant infrastructural problem, but the technology exists to solve that in solutions like Apogee. I think that a greater problem is the sociology of your organization in terms of change and the speed of change, and also mindset. So historically, when a company has managed the entire process themselves, everybody knew what success looked like. It was new sales, it was happier customers, it was reduced costs, if there was an innovation. Now, inside ecosystems, different measures will emerge to indicate success. And success is being part of winning ecosystems, rather than focusing on the organization itself being the sole winner from an initiative. And this suggests different types of measures of success, and these different types of measures of success need to be inserted into people's personal objectives. So this is a radical change in how people see the marketplace, and then how they behave, and then what gets regarded and measured as success. In terms of stakeholders and getting bankers focused on ecosystems, I don't think it's going to be difficult for bankers to recognize the significance of digital ecosystems. Banking as an industry is 4,000 years old, so we can reasonably say that there's been spectacular changes in the environment and in technology and in people's behavior over several thousand years. The job of the banker is to move capital from mature businesses and mature households into immature households and immature businesses so that the economy can grow for everybody's benefit. So in that context, bankers have adjusted to a lot, and now they need to figure out how to carry out banking in this new environment where they recycle capital from mature businesses and mature households to immature businesses and immature households. What is fair to say, though, is that this change is so radical that banking will almost certainly survive because it's survived thousands of years of change. Perhaps individual banks will not survive if they retain a product focus for too long rather than adjusting to an ecosystems focus. I think retail and telco are probably ahead of banking in this context, and multiple retails and telcos have demonstrated an ability to increase their innovation speed and increase their competitive effect through ecosystems. They are relying more and more on external partners to drive their innovation, which cuts their internal costs, and they're driving a significant increase in volume and reuse of their telecom services or their retail services in multiple segments of the market that they couldn't reach through their own distribution efforts, and now by distributing through an ecosystem, they're doing this successfully. So in many ways, retail and telco are ahead of banks, and they will probably be looking at open banking regulations that are emerging across the world as a significant opportunity to extend their contribution to financial services. Well, I think ecosystems are relevant to all service industries and indeed goods industries that have a services component. Even at the most practical level for every business, you'll find even as every typical business is carrying out data processing both in relation to their bank, in relation to their accountants, in relation to their auditors, and in many, many ways, much of this data gathering and data processing is duplicated. That very similar data is being worked on multiple times, and that the sharing of this data is quite ineffective. Open banking holds out huge promise for companies in that, in terms of providing information about their banking to their accountants with permission can access data directly from the bank. In relation to annual audits and inspections, data can be sourced with the client's permission directly from the bank. And all of this gives rise to automation opportunities, data analytics, machine learning. All of those things will cut costs, cut frauds, cut fees for all these activities, and will substantially increase the ability of all businesses to focus on their core purpose, which is serving customers and growing their business. Well, research has demonstrated that companies that embrace APIs see typically, on average, a 10% increase in their market value. And it's interesting that their market value actually increases more sharply than their short-term profitability. And that would suggest that the investment market sees companies that have adopted APIs as becoming significantly more flexible in their business strategy, in that they have turned their services into modules, reusable modules that can be deployed through APIs, both internally and externally, so that their internal change projects go faster, and their ability to add more partners more quickly. And whereas the temptation with new technologies is to look for breakthrough use cases that are spectacular successes, the common trend amongst companies that look at rebuild their organization's capabilities into APIs is that they're flexible and faster, and they're doing their traditional business models much, much faster with many more people, and that's what's driving the increases in their valuations of their companies. I think there's multiple use cases that any company looking at APIs can research. There's telecom companies that, such as T-Mobile in the US, that went from number 4 in its industry to number 1 over several years by focusing on APIs which radically improve their internal processes and improve their customer experience and the number of digital interfaces that their customers could experience their services. And they became a consistent winner of all customer satisfaction awards. There are retailers in Brazil have switched from a traditional distribution approach like Magazine Luiza into full ecosystem strategies, almost following the Amazon playbook, play-by-play, and have had huge 60-70% increases in their valuation in the stock market. But I do think that use cases have some value, but I do think that in corporations they need to educate all of their staff on the features of ecosystems, how they operate, how they create much more value for both the customers and for the successful companies within them, and then crucially examine how they communicate, how they set up innovation, who makes what decision. So companies that have embraced an analysis of this radical transformation in business processes and then apply it to their own specific circumstances. So consultants will give you use cases, vendors will give you use cases, but for companies to be successful, it's a leadership challenge, because leaders need to be both technologists and understand these new technologies, but also sociologists, and explain to people how these new technologies give rise to different ways of working, different ways of making decisions, different ways of communicating, different ways of partnering, and different ways of measuring success. So the one common characteristic of all the use cases is, to my mind, not which particular industry and which particular significant impact. It's the common factor is leadership. Leadership have said we need to have a different mindset because the way services are being delivered is now becoming radically different. And I would say in the use cases, what companies should look for is how did leadership prompt and catalyze this impact, because that's what they need to follow rather than the specific business ideas. Well, I think independent assessors of vendors like Gartner have singled out Apigee as the global number one because of both their vision and their execution. So, which is great for them. What I think is interesting is that how vision is part of it, and I would put vendors in this API management space into two categories, I suppose. There's those that are fine technology companies that can consider what may be required for API management, but many of these companies themselves aren't highly active in ecosystems. And I do think what you want from a vendor is both an understanding of the technology you require and the sociology you require inside your organization, of what type of tools do you need to help your people embrace the technology. And I think Apigee is very much in the latter group, especially now even more so when they've become part of the Google organization, is that they're providing technology that's world leading in terms of its ability to manage your business in a world of ecosystems, but it's coming from a vendor that lives and breathes ecosystems. So I think if you're comparing the two side by side, obviously budget and timing and history and things all play a part, but I do think vendor solutions are coming in two groups, those that live and breathe ecosystems and those who don't. And I would recommend sourcing from companies like Apigee who live and breathe ecosystems.